Let us have a closer look at how the methodology section looks like for a systematic literature review. Now, systematic literature review, and these studies or this methodology is more about having a look at what has already been published in this field and analyzing existing publications to see what insights or what kind of classifications or what kind of frameworks we can build based on previously conducted and published work. So in essence, it is a meta study where you study already published works. Now, we are talking about systematic literature review. Systematic means that we have to ensure that the process is systematic in selecting, in analyzing the papers we have chosen. It cannot be a random selection of publications. It cannot be selecting papers I like, because then it's not systematic, then it's not scientific. So we are going to talk about how we consider systematic in this regard. Literature, of course, means that it's all the papers that we have included in this. It's a study of published literature. And in this regard, there can be two directions or a combination of both. One can be that we only look at academic papers, meaning publications that have been published in scientific outputs. Those have the benefit of already having been reviewed by at least 2 or 3 other scientists or academics or researchers. But sometimes we also would like to include other material that is non-academic. And that could be reports, white papers, that could be results from different studies, anything that is basically non-academic. Now, these papers, such as maybe consultancy, reports from consultancy firms, could also be very valuable. But the difference here is that they have not been subjected to peer review prior to publication. So in academic papers, when you have something in an academic outlet published, it means that somebody, or at least usually 2 or at least 3 people, other academics, have reviewed, ensured that this paper fulfills the quality criteria of a scientific publication. Whereas in a non-academic, it doesn't have to be, nobody has necessarily reviewed it. It's just an output of some people or one person who have done some independent research or in collaboration with some people, put together some stuff and presented it. You'll notice that non-academic literature don't follow the same rigorous structure that academic papers do. So here we call this gray literature rather than the academic one. Now, a systematic literature review can be focused on only academic. It could be focused on only gray, or it could be a combination of both. Review means that we take all of these papers that we have systematically identified, and we basically extract data from these, and what we take with that data is that we produce some kind of a contribution, some kind of a result. This is what a systematic literature review is. Now let's look at the outline of this section in your thesis. This is a suggestion, by no means the only way, but here is a suggestion. Commonly, it's section number 3, first one being introduction, second one being background or related work, and then third one is methodology. Now, what I would propose is that the first paragraph just gives a heads up to the reader of what to expect when reading this section. So basically, something like, in this section, we present the methodology beginning with research questions, blah, 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 blah. This is not necessary, but it might be one of those things that makes it a bit easier to start writing, and also helps the reader to know what to expect from this section. Then we move on to the second paragraph. And in the second paragraph, here, what we want to do is that we want to present the method we are using in this thesis, which means that, and this is a way of doing it, it says that you can say the research objective of this paper, or the main goal of this thesis, or the overarching research question being addressed in this thesis is, and then you give a summary of that, of a one sentence or maybe two sentences. Then when you say that the way we are going to address this, the way we are going to answer this, the way we are going to achieve this research objective is by employing the method of systematic literature review. And then after you have said that, and you use a reference, and there are always standard references here, Kitchenham is one of them. What you then do is that you explain why systematic literature review is suitable methodology for achieving your research objective, or for addressing your overarching or main research questions. So basically, the motivation, why SLR. And then within the same paragraph, we also explain a bit what SLR is. Now, this is how we would go. So we have this method. Now we have that first paragraph we talked about. Now it's the second paragraph. First, it's about the research objective, or the main overarching research objective, or the main overarching, or the main research question that you're trying to address. Then you're saying that I'm going to use this methodology to do so. And then you're going to say why you're using SLR to address the research questions that you have. And then you can say that SLR consists of 3 stages or steps, and we will talk about these ones right now. One being preparation, second one being what is often referred to as executing the protocol, or conducting the literature review. Conducting, and third one is the reporting. So the second paragraph has these components. Now, of course, when you say I am going to use SLR, you can't just say I'm going to use SLR because it is very good for this, blah, blah, blah. You also have to give a very brief explanation of what SLR methodology is. And when you say what it is, you can hook it up to why then, therefore, this is particularly useful, or why this would help me achieve the research objective or the overarching research question. And then you say, well, SLR basically has 3 steps: preparation, conducting the SLR, and the reporting. Now, when we talk about SLR, because what we want to do is to make sure that it's systematic in the SLR, right? It means that in terms of scientific process, it needs to be reproducible. So it means that the way you went to find the set of papers that you will include in your SLR has to be replicable, meaning that I should be able to follow the same steps and come to exactly the same list of papers. So in order for that to happen, you need to be very systematic. Plus, you need to be very clear of how you did it. If I can't, because if I'm supposed to be able to replicate this, then you have to clarify all the steps very clearly, why you did it, how you did it, what the result is that you got, and that led you to this list of papers. And I should be able to take this instruction that you have described here, or this very clear description, and I should just be able to follow it as if it was in a laboratory. And then I should come to the same conclusion in terms of list of papers. That is why we have this explanation here. We called it systematic literature review protocol. A systematic literature review protocol is a detailed description of how you are going to do this. So let me just reiterate here. SLR has 3 steps. One is prep. Second is the execution or the conducting of the SLR. And 3 is the reporting. Reporting, we're going to talk about later. This is where you have the results and the discussion. This is your thesis. That's how you're reporting the results of your SLR. Execution is where you do the actual work, and we'll discuss. And that's basically the execution of what? The protocol. So you have to first define the way you're going to do it, which is the preparation. And that means that you write the SLR protocol. In the next step, you execute it, and then you report the results. So every thesis that is SLR, in the thesis, in chapter 3 or section 3, you present a summary of the review protocol. But you also have a separate document as a supplementary material that is the actual protocol. And bear in mind, the protocol must be written in a way that somebody else can take that document, follow it step by step, and come to the same list of papers as you did. Very good. So now we've talked about first paragraph, second paragraph, and we talked a bit about what SLR is and the 3 steps of the SLR. It is very good if you, in the second paragraph, between the second paragraph and the third paragraph, put in a visual, a graph, some kind of a description of the main steps. So because the SLR has 3 steps, this is the prep, this is the execution, and this is the reporting, the graph should follow this one. Now, what you can do here is that you can put as input, you have your research questions, then you have the preparation, execution, and so forth and so on. And here you can actually list the steps, the main steps that you will do, and the main steps here, and the reporting, you don't need to include the main steps because that's what the rest of the thesis is about. So having some kind of a graphical description of the steps is very helpful. And I'll tell you why. Because third paragraph, when you're going to start actually summarizing this whole part, you can piggyback that on the graph. So you can say that here I'm talking about this, which corresponds to this part of the graph. And it helps the reader to get an overview of the whole methodology. And as you're describing all of these details about the methodology, you can connect it to the graph, helping the reader to navigate where they are in the methodology process. Third paragraph is going to be about the research questions. You tell about the research questions, and that is basically you first You clearly, explicitly say what the research question is, and it could be several. And in a systematic literature review, there are commonly several research questions. And then you give a motivation. The motivation means that you first explain what you mean by this research question and why it is relevant to have to ask this question. Why is it needed? Why is it important? Why do you have this research question in your systematic literature review? That's the motivation. Now, once you've done that, we can move on to the fourth paragraph. And now I'm going to say fourth and fifth and sixth, but each part here is going to take more than one paragraph. So it's more the section. So let's say that it's now, we're talking about point 4 in this outline of the methodology. So this is now where you start talking about the preparation, which is basically the summary of the review protocol. Now, there are a couple of steps here you have to follow. First, you're going to identify papers. That means that you have to first define the search strings you are going to use. Now, how do you do that? Well, first you say, these are the keywords I am going to use. And the keywords are going to be first from your research questions. So if your research question is about what are the current approaches for identifying waiting times in business processes using event logs or using execution data. So we're talking about a couple of keywords here. One is, of course, process mining. The other one is, of course, waiting times. And then you look at the second research question, you see what key terms do you need to get out of there, and so forth and so on. And then sometimes you might say that, well, the waiting time that I'm looking for is sometimes referred to as wastes. So therefore, I'm also going to include the keyword waste. Sometimes they refer to this as temporal inefficiencies. That's why I'm also going to use the keyword temporal. So you start building, you start identifying the keywords that you are going to use in your search string. Then what you have to do, so what you do is that you identify, so these are the things you're going to do. You're going to identify keywords, and you start with the research questions, and then you build on that. And then what you're going to do is to motivate or explain why you're using these keywords. And once you've done that, you have the components to define your search string. And the search string is using these keywords together with and or and things like that in order to actually apply it to an electronic database to get the results. So then what you say is basically, so using these keywords, I formulate the following search string. And then it would be process mining, and waiting time, and then you might go like or temporal or waste. And this becomes the search string. And you can have several search strings. You can have 1, 2, 3, or you can have variations. So the first part here is about the search string, defining the search string. And in order to define the search string, you first need to have the keywords. And in order to get the keywords, you need to go back to your research questions, start there, and then include keywords that might be somehow related to your main keywords from the research questions. And all of this is to help you identify the most relevant papers. A pro tip here. Don't just start doing this philosophically. Start with the identification of keywords, start using some of them, and then test it out. Test it out on these electronic search databases and see if they work. If you get a lot of crazy results, then you refine the search string. You see that, oh, I have to remove this word because it is completely irrelevant, or I have to add a certain keyword because it is now, I see from my experiments that it's working better. And this testing out, you write that in the review protocol as well, that you tested out these keywords, came to the conclusion that they are producing too many false results. Therefore, you remove that one, you added this keyword and so on. Why? Because the protocol is supposed to be something that I can replicate. So be careful, it should be detailed there and explaining the whole process. Once you have the search string, you have the search string, we need to apply it somewhere. And they usually call it electronic databases. There are some web pages where they have a database of a lot of publications. So you need to identify which ones you're going to apply it on. Most common one is Scopus, Web of Science, IEEE, I think it's called Explore. And there are a few more. And of course, Google Scholar is also a database for publications. So here, once you have the search strings, you have to say which databases you applied it on, which ones, and why these databases. Motivation, motivation, motivation. So what's going to happen is that when you apply all of those things, you're going to get thousands of results. So we need to somehow filter it down so we can examine only the relevant ones. So how do I go from this 1,000 papers? How do I reduce that number to a more manageable number? And then finally to the list of papers that I am going to actually examine in detail and extract data from. Well, how we do that is that we basically do it with what we call inclusion and exclusion criteria. What is this? Inclusion, exclusion criteria are simply criteria we use to filter out which papers to discard in the trash bin and which papers to include. So you might say, and it might be reasonable to begin with exclusion criteria. You go exclusion criteria 1. The paper is not in English. So if it's not in English, you're going to discard it. And then you give an explanation why, because then I don't understand it, right? It's understandability reasons. Maybe the paper is too short and is shorter than 4 pages. Because what you want to do is to extract quite a lot of knowledge. And the assumption here is that if the paper is less than 4 pages or less, or 5 pages or less, they cannot go in that depth that you require for data extraction. They simply cannot go to that because there's not space enough to elaborate on their method or their thinking for you to get valuable data out of it. Another exclusion criteria is duplicates. What happens is that when you look at these different databases, the same paper is going to pop up in different databases. So you have exact duplicates, but you have another type of duplicate as well. The other type is that it's the same paper, but one is a conference paper and the other one is a journal paper. Because sometimes authors would first publish in a conference and then they enhance it and publish it in a journal. And these ones, what we do is basically that you define what you mean by exact duplicates, meaning that exact duplicates is when you have the same paper with the same title, with the same authors in the same year in multiple databases, then you exclude all of the redundant ones and keep only one. When you have a case where the paper is written by the same authors, but the title might be different, and one is in a conference and one is in a journal, we usually exclude the conference version because we assume that the journal version is going to be more refined, has more content because it's a longer paper and perhaps a bit more rigorous review as well. So then so you're going to go say, and I'm going to use the journal version of it. So the exclusion criteria are quite standard, and we'll see a list of them that you can gain inspiration from when we look at some examples. The inclusion criteria is a bit more trickier. What you want to do is to have an inclusion criteria that kind of widely goes down and brings it to the relevant papers. Where do you get the inclusion criteria from? You get that from the research questions. So in the example we had about waiting times in business processes using process mining, first inclusion criteria can be, is this paper using a process, any kind of process mining technique or approach? I mean, is it using event logs? Is it data driven? So if it's yes, then you include the paper and you go to the next criteria. Because if it's not using process mining, it's not within your scope because your scope is process mining. So then you include it. Include. The next one could be that, well, it is about process mining, but is it about waiting times in any way or form? Well, if it's not, it's about compliance, or if it's about performance, or if it's about variance, then has nothing to do with waiting time, or it doesn't have a component of waiting time, then you exclude it. But if it does, yes, you include it and you go to the next one. Now, next one here might be, do they present, because your research question is about what are the approaches to identify and measure waiting time in business processes using process mining. Okay, so do they measure the temporal impact? So you can have a paper that is about process mining, that is about waiting times, but it's not about analysis of waiting times. It's just that they talk about waiting times in a more, I don't know, indirect way or overall. So do they actually talk about the temporal aspect, using process mining for temporal? Yes, very good. Then you go to the next one. Do they present a method or an approach or a tool that can analyze waiting times? Yes, and then you go like that until you come to these most relevant papers. Again, remember the reproducible replicability, that I am supposed to be able to read your protocol and do the same. So you have to be clear as to what inclusion criteria you're using, so it's not open for interpretation. And you have to also be clear about why you have included this, so I understand that. And then when I read the papers, I replicate your method. I will see that, okay, yes, then I have to exclude this paper and so on. Now, when you do this part, this is the planning part, okay? This is when you plan it. But when you then report it, you have to show the numbers. And it can be that you have a table where you basically say that you began with 1,000 papers and you had exclusion criteria 1, filtered out this many, you remain with 923, exclusion criteria, and then it was 802, and so forth, and you come to inclusion criteria 1, and then here's 500, inclusion criteria 3, 4, and then gradually it becomes 300, 123, and then finally you have a list of papers of 48 papers, or 148, or whatever it might be. So you have to keep a very good track of this. The way you do that is by using Excel sheet. So you import all the papers in the Excel sheet, and then you can start playing with those. Well, you're not playing. What you can do is that you import all the papers, and what you do is usually you have the author, the title, the year, sometimes citation, and the venue it has been published, and so on. And then you have in Excel, you have one sheet for example, Scopus. You have one sheet for Web of Science, and one sheet for, I don't know, IEEE. Once you have the all raw data, you can merge them. You can merge them, but you keep all these old Excels. Do not delete them. You can merge them into one sheet. And here you can use the function of duplicate removal that Excel has. You can sort them based on the page length. You can sort out the ones that are not in English. And for every step that you filter, create a new sheet in Excel. And keep the numbers, so you know how many papers you had, how many you deleted. And then at the end of it, you have to present that in the paper as well, in the thesis as well. So it should be very transparent as to how you went from the initial 2,000 papers to the final list of, say, 78 papers. Now, one of the things that you do is that once you have come to, let's say, your list of 67 final papers, is that there is, of course, a great chance that you have actually missed a couple of papers. So what we're going to do there is this, what we call a backward referencing. Sometimes they call it snowballing, backward and forward referencing. There are different terminologies and different ways of doing it. But the whole idea here is that if I have one of these 67 papers, I look at it. I look at the references that are included in this paper. The concept is this: if this paper is relevant to my work, it passed all the inclusion-exclusion criteria, it is relevant, and it's on topic of what I'm looking at, it is very likely that they would cite papers that are also very relevant to what I am looking at. Therefore, I look at the citations that this paper has included, and I see if any of them seems by the title very interesting that I have not already included in the 67 papers I have. If there is a paper that seems to be very relevant and I have not included it, I'll have a close look at that paper, apply the same inclusion-exclusion criteria, and if it is relevant, I'll add it. So now I have 68. This is the idea of backward referencing. And this you also explain how you do in the methodology, in the protocol, and in section 3 of your thesis. Now, the next step is that I have identified the search strings. Okay, I have identified the electronic databases. I have identified how to filter. I haven't done this. I've just, designed the whole way of how I will define it. Then when I have my papers, I need to do the data extraction. What data will I extract from all of these papers that I have on my final list of papers? Now, this part basically has two components. One is more metadata of the paper. The author, the title of the paper, the year it was published. It might be citations. It might be even sometimes the abstract or keywords and so on. So this is not actually content related to what I am studying or to my research questions, but it is metadata about the paper that I need in order to organize it and structure it and so on. Second part is the data I need for my actual research question. So how you define what data to extract here is going to come again from your research question. So you have to specify, I am going to extract data, this data, this data, and this data. And you're going to explain why you chose to extract this data. And the why is going to be connected to the research question. So for instance, if my research question is what are the current approaches for analyzing waiting times using process mining, I might want to extract the data of what waiting time did they analyze? What was the method used? What was the algorithm used? How did they, what is the metrics used? So then I will explain that these are the different aspects of answering this research question that I would extract from the data. That then constitutes the data extraction. Now, what happens here is that now you have done your protocol. Now you are ready to do, you have done the preparation, which basically is a protocol. Now you are ready to execute, which means to implement it, to actually start using the search strings on the databases, extracting the data, all the papers, applying the exclusion inclusion filters, come down to a list of 77, 67 or whatever it might be papers, look at them, do the backward referencing to add papers, and then for each paper you have as your list of final papers, extract data from them. And this is the execution. And this you also have to describe in your thesis. You have to describe exactly the numbers, how many you got from database A, B, C, how many papers were identified, how many were excluded, which I talked about a bit before, how many were included, and how many you added in the backward referencing, and how you extracted the data. And commonly, you do that in an Excel sheet, and you also add that whole Excel sheet as a supplementary material to your thesis. That whole Excel sheet that has all the data you have extracted. This is the execution, and you have to describe that as well. So this is how you're going to do it, and this is descriptive of what numbers you got and the steps and so on when you actually execute it. So let's have a look at an example of two examples of systematic literature review. Let's look at an example here. This is a systematic literature review on business process flexibility. And you can see here that they have this standard abstract, the introduction we talked about. And now we come to the methodology part here. So in the beginning here, you can see that they are clearly talking about the systematic literature review, which presents a fair evaluation and so forth and so on. And then they talk about why they have used this and to get a credible evaluation of the research work and so on. That's why they use the systematic literature review. Then they talk about the different components of a systematic literature review, which is the planning, the conducting, and the reporting, and they elaborate on each part. Then we come to the actual planning here of the systematic literature review. So they begin with the research questions. You see that they have defined the research question very clearly. They elaborate, they specifically, explicitly talk about the research question, and they give an explanation as why they have included this research question. We can see that it's research question 1, 2, 3, and 3 actually has 2 sub-questions, and research question 4. Further on, we can see that they go on now from the research question, which is the input to the review protocol, and they talk about developing their systematic literature review protocol. This is, of course, a summary. Somewhere else, there is another document where the review protocol is included. They begin here with the databases they're looking for. So they didn't begin with the search strings, they began with the databases. I would have done it with search strings first, but this is a question of just preference. The common culprits here are the unusual suspects for databases: IEEE Explore, ACM, Scopus, and the Web of Science. Let's see if I can, yes. So so they did that first. Let me just, okay. So they did that first. Now what we can see, what they do here is that they actually now start talking about at the beginning, the query included keywords derived from the proposed research questions 1 to 4, combined through the logical connections of and or. Okay, very good. Then the query was updated according to the experience of the authors in order to capture frequently occurring words in titles and abstracts of the relevant papers. So in the review protocol, they have explained this more in detail, but what they're saying here is that they began with taking keywords from the research questions. They tried it out, noticed that there were some key terms coming up which they had not included, and they refined the keywords in order to get better results. And meaning when they say they use the logical connectors and or, it means that they were experimenting with the search strings. So here we can see, for example, here we can see that they were included in the generic form. So they talk about dynamic. Let me see if I can. They talk about dynamic, they talk about self-adaptation, context awareness, and then they talk about that they included these ones. So they also talk about why they have included these ones. For example, they say that BPMN is included. This is motivated by the fact that even though SLR objective is not blah, 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 they included that because of whatever reason it might be. So two things here. First, they talk about the key terms, but also the databases they applied it to. Now, they don't write out the actual search strings they used in the paper. It is probably in the protocol. I propose you write out the search strings that you used. Oh, actually, they do. Look, here is the search string. They clarify that the whole search string. So they even put the very specific search string they used for the electronic search databases. Then they talk about, as part of the protocol implementation, set of inclusion and exclusion criteria were defined. They now talk about each criteria that they have used and the motivation. And as I said, they also have it in a table. As you can see here, there is the table with the inclusion exclusion criteria. Then they go on to talk about identification and selection of research papers. This is now the execution. Then you go, wait, what happened with the data extraction? They put it a bit further down, and I'll talk about that in a short moment. But they now talk about the execution. As you can see, they identified 1,333 papers. They removed the duplicates, got 1,173, and they explained the whole process. What they also do is that they show this in some graphical form, where they began with, they got this many papers from IEEE, this many papers from ACM, and so forth and so on. Then they removed the duplicate, they got this many papers, then they applied the criteria, and they got this many papers. I would propose you refine this a bit more. It's too big of a jump from 1,173 to 164. So I would say that you also specify this per inclusion criteria if possible. Now, there is one more thing they did here, which I didn't talk about, and that is the quality evaluation. See, some SLRs, it is recommended, but it's kind of not mandatory in an SLR, is to also look for the quality of the paper, specifically when we talk about academic papers. What that means is that the idea that if the research has been very rigorous and you detect that by the text clearly stating the research aim and so forth and so on, then the value of the results are higher. And you might then say that, okay, I will only focus on research papers that are of high quality, which means that if they fail the quality evaluation, you also exclude them. It becomes another exclusion criteria, but we don't include that in the normal criteria. And how can you do that assessment? Well, they have done it in a very simple way. They have looked at use this reference, and they looked at these aspects. So they asked the question, is the paper based on research? Is there adequate description? Was the data analysis sufficiently rigorous? And if they say yes, they go on with the paper. But if it turns out that no, one or two or three or four of these questions cannot be positively affirmed, then they would exclude it. So here you have that they basically came to the conclusion that all papers were of high quality. Now, this is when you're doing academic papers. Well, you have a choice here. They chose to exclude if it did not live up to the high standards. But you can also do so that you put some kind of a scoring where papers that were maybe not to the highest, but still good, you can give them a ranking. And what you do then is that in the results, you give more weight to those that are of the highest quality. Basically, if a high quality paper says X, you rely more on that than if a lower quality paper says X. When you do gray literature, when you include non-academic work, this becomes quite important because you do not want to give the same weight to a white paper or a opinion or a blog post as an academic paper with a very rigorous research protocol. So that was about that. Then what we do is this data extraction, and they talk about data extraction. And here what you can see is that they talk about this, about the data fields that they use. One is that they talk about, well, this is the form, which is the Excel sheet where they do the data extraction, but they talk about that they include the metadata, the title, publication, year, publication venue, publication type, and so forth and so on. But they also talk about the content data that they extract. And they go in a very beautiful way to in order to answer research question 1, and they remind you of the research question. We selected the following 6 attributes. This is the first one, exceptions, and then they give a very good explanation about why they included exceptions, what they mean with exceptions. And they continue with technology, which is the second attribute, the same way. And as you can see, they actually done this for every single research question. So here, for example, we're at research question 2. We can continue to see that here they are talking about research question 3, which talks about process family and business rule and so forth and so on. And then it's the results of the systematic literature review, which we'll talk about later. Now, before we conclude this, let's take a look at one more example. This is a paper, systematic literature review on the architecture of business process management systems. This is a bit different, so we're going to look at this one as well to give some variety to it. Here they talk about the review protocol. You see that the naming of the headings are a bit different. And they talk about the review protocol used to conduct the systematic literature study. Study specifies the research question, and then they give you which section they will talk about that. The search protocol, the section there. Selection criteria, that's the inclusion-exclusion criteria that they used. And they also talk about, in order to ensure the quality of the study, they use the guidelines provided in these references. So they now then move on to talking about who did what, but we can skip that. In your thesis, you're going to do the work. So here, first part is the research questions. Again, you see beautifully, this is the research question. This is the motivation and the explanation of why they have this research question. And we go on, as you can see, there are a lot of research questions here. 5 of them is the last one, which they then discuss here. Now, then they go to the search strings. And here you see how they beautiful they do it. They talk about the reference of it, of course, and then they say that we use the terms BPMS and architecture, which is clearly from the whole objective of the study, were derived from the research questions as the main search term of the study. Then they talk about that they would use a business process management system, workflow management system, orchestration, and so choreography, and so on. He says that they will use these ones as alternative terms for BPMS, meaning that BPMS is the standard term that is now, but some people refer to it in different ways, so we include all of those. Then they talk about the Boolean and that they use to connect these search terms, and that they use the or as well for when they use that. So it is either BPMS or business process management system. So they did this, they talk about that, and then they give you the search strings. So they have 5 search strings. Well, actually, they have one big search string because they're connected with or, but they present it in this way for easily understanding, which is much easier to understand this rather than the one that the previous example that was just a long text of 4 rows. Then they talk about search sources. These are the electronic databases they used. So they clearly say that the second action of the search strategy was to choose the sources. And here they talk about it, but they also have a table showing that these were the sources they looked at. You see, it's the same usual suspects. It's Web of Science, ACM. Scopus should be there as well. Then they talk about the selection criteria. This is the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Now I'm going to go. You see, they have the inclusion criteria A1, inclusion criteria A2. They go even advanced here, and they talk a little bit about accessibility criteria, paper-specific criteria, and content criteria. So they even classify the different types of criteria, which is very nice. It's very nicely done. I'm going to give you this table where they also talk about where they summarize the criteria. Usually there's always a summary of the criteria in form of a table if there is space. Here you can see the whole list of all the inclusion and exclusion criteria that they used in this study. So once they've done that, you can see that they also had one criteria that is a bit different. When you have way too many papers, making it not feasible to read through, I don't know, so many papers. You have 800 relevant papers. It's just too much. What they can do is that you can basically say that you're going to look at the citations. And the idea is that if a paper from 10 years ago is impactful, is relevant, then it has been cited. But if the paper hasn't been cited at all, then maybe it's not that relevant. Maybe nobody found this paper to be of such value to even cite. Now, you can do this for a bit older papers, but a paper that is published this year, well, it maybe just hasn't had the time to get citations. So what they do, and you can go look at this paper if you want, is that they basically have a complicated formula for determining the citations and which papers to include. Idea is basically this. You calculate an average citation, and then you include the papers that are above that citation. This is a way of reducing the number of papers. And you can see here from the graph that this is what they have done. And you can also see that based on the years, they have actually clustered it in years. So to capture this, that if this paper was in 2016, you see in 2015 papers there had 0 citations, but they would include all the papers with 0 citations because it's not reasonable to assume that a paper that has recently been published has the same number of citations of a paper that had been published 10 years ago. Then the last part after the inclusion criteria is the conducting the review. This is where they implement the protocol, and they describe this here, and you start seeing that they have the numbers here, how many papers they started finding, how many they were excluded, and how many they ended up with at the end of the day. And then they say that table 3 shows the results. Let's see if we can see table 3. This is the results here that they began. Now they were not one person who did it, there were two persons who did it, but nevertheless, this is the point that is interesting. So they had basically excluded 68 papers based on this criteria, and based on this was 3, so forth and so forth. So they concluded 41 at the end of it. The thing that they don't talk about here is the actual data that they chose to extract. I'm not sure if they talk about that at all, but they probably have referred it to. No, here you have. So yes, here it is. To begin this, so they talk about which electronic database they were taking it, the title, the author, the year, the source, the citation. And then they use some kind of a program. I'm not sure exactly if they did specify. No, they don't specify exactly what. They just conclude that we agreed on 41 primary studies that were considered to be appropriate for the final inclusion, and they present that. Well, nevertheless, they should have maybe, I think they put it in the review protocol instead and saved some space in the paper. But in your case, you have to do that. You have to specify what data you have extracted. So to conclude, systematic literature review, begin by motivating that you're using systematic literature review, then the research questions, then you go to the search strings, then you go to the databases that you're going to use, then you talk about inclusion plus exclusion criteria, then you talk about the data you're going to extract, then you execute. This is the preparation, the prep. Then you execute and give the numbers of what you have there, and then the reporting will come in the rest of the thesis.